Ali sve vreme je bilo u suštini to sa defund the police je bilo dosta konkretno sa zahtevima, ali tako? Meni se čini da je od početka onako baš su bili jasni zahtevi i ono lokalni u smislu all municipalities for themselves i kao potpuno precizni zahtevi. To mi je super.
Da, ali je vrlo teško da prođe, znaš, Bafak je vrlo segregiran i mislim tako da to će biti it's gonna be a struggle.
Da, i kod nas je, mislim, meni je zanimljivo da posmatram, jer mislim sad Black Lives Matter jeste neki pokret koji praktično menja ceo narativ, znači terate nekako da sve menjaš. I sad primećujem, mislim, bar to kreće nekako iz ovih grassroot organizacija, da kada se govori o ljudima koji leže u zatvoru, da se sada prvi put pominju da su to siromašni ljudi, da su Romi u tim zatvorima i tako dalje. To ranije nismo mogli da čujemo. Iako su naravno komentari, mislim, ono, možeš misliti, razumeš, ono, kad čuju tako nešto. Od toga da kao mi sad želimo da su najveći kriminalci slobodni, razumeš, te neke patetične priče, do ono, rasističkih komentara i tako dalje. Mislim, to je sad kod nas nekako mrvica, bukvalno na nivou, ajde ako kažemo, diskurzivnog nekog artikulisanja. Ali nemaš još nikakve pokrete oko toga, mislim, koji bi baš to nekako te fokusirali. To je abolicionizam, razumiješ, to kao... To nema.
Ali znaš, i tu je isti problem zbog toga što, mislim, kapitalizam je rasistički, ali imaš i puno, znaš, imaš i ljudi koji su crnci, koji su na pozicija i koji su liberali i koji su isti problem. Tako da je to teško zbog toga što to je class and race issue, ne?
Da. Evo, Zoran nam signalizira da bi bilo lepo da krenemo.
Da.
Ajde, ja ću da počnem sa uvodom, da pređemo na engleski jezik. Good evening and welcome to part 3 of our conversation series, Vectors of Collective Imagination in Art. This conversation series is a space for discussion about ideas and practices related to art groups and collectives, as well as the artistic infrastructures for the collective action, including production of knowledge and organizing political and revolutionary struggles. The series consists of 3 conversations. 20 days ago, I talked with Tomislav Medak and Cassie Thornton about connections between art and social movements and about artistic platforms for collective care, hologram and pirate care. And 10 days ago, I talked with Vida Knežević and Jacopo Galimberti about the links between art groups and leftist movements, organizations and political parties before World War II and during the 1960s, as well as issues about political organizing in art. Our guests today are Katja Praznik, a researcher from Slovenia who currently lives and works in Buffalo, New York, and Sezgin Bojnik, a researcher from Priština who lives and works in Helsinki. Katja Praznik will tackle art as labor issues and the questions of tactical advantages of such thinking for artistic organizations. And Sezgin Bojnik will talk more about the relationships between art collectives and ideology and the implication of certain conceptualizations of collectives to social changes, whole and societal transformation. These conversations are part of the project Art Organization, a long-term international research project that deals with the analysis of artistic self-organization in Yugoslav and post-Yugoslav region. Simultaneously with this series of talks, Collaborative Research Working Group is meeting on Mondays through the program called Fragments for Studies on Art Organizations to analyze and review the material created during the project. This is a body of material consisting of interviews with the actors of that period, curators, art historians, as well as artists and art collectives that were active during Yugoslav period, in anti-Yugoslav period, and in the current context. So one of the outcomes of this project will be edited volume, Fragments for Studies on Art Organization in Yugoslavia, that will include articles authored by Milica Pekić, Stevan Vuković, Ana Perajca, Lina Đuverović, Andrej Mirčev, Leila Topić, Anthony Iles i Sasha Kahir. And the introduction will be by myself. Before we start, I would like to give you a short update about the situation in Serbia. Many people got arrested during the protest in Serbia against mismanagement of COVID crisis on the side of government, as well as the years of austerity measures that have pushed people of Serbia to the edge of survival. Some claim that there are more than 150 people in jail today. Many of these people are our friends and comrades. Two of our comrades, Vladimir Mentus and Igor Šljapić, have been released just to be convicted again in less than 48 hours. So these two comrades belong to the same organization as I do. It's called the Joint Action Group Over the Head. It's anti-eviction organization in Serbia. These arrests clearly represent an attempt to frighten people into obedience so that we wouldn't stand up to the tyranny. We will not stop fighting until the very last political prisoner and victim of the regime oppression is free. During the webinar, we will be running a live chat. So if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat. Darija Medić, artist, digital practitioner, and educator, will moderate the chat session and give a summary of discussions during the session. She will also read your questions to our guests. If you have any technical issues, please ask Darija to help you in the chat. If you miss anything, don't worry. The recording will be available on the website of kuda.org after this event. My name is Ana Vilenica. I'm an activist, a researcher, and theoretician of social movement, housing struggles, and art. I will be your host today. I would like to thank kuda.org from Novi Sad for giving me a chance to organize this encounter. I hope you will enjoy this talk as much as I did preparing it. So the last time, kind of questions and answers session format gave us a chance to develop a comparative perspective between two case studies, Group Life, Život, and Group N from Italy. Today, we will use the same format to discuss statuses of labor in art collectives and ideologies and the function of art collectives for the so-called transition period. I would like to welcome our guests, Katja Praznik and Sezgin Bojnik. Welcome. I met Katja in London 2 years ago, I think for the first time. We spoke together on the roundtable Immaterial and Wasteful Artistic Labor at MEXA conference at London South Bank University. And I don't know exactly, but I think I met Sezgin actually in Novi Sad many years ago, and I cannot really recall why he was there, but he comes to Serbia often, and as I heard, he will come soon again. So I want to use this chance to thank them both for their work over the years. Thank you, Katja, and thank you, Sezgin. I have learned so much from you, and thank you for finding time to join us tonight. So Katja, I know that you have been writing and researching about the art collectives in Yugoslavia and also in, let's say, post-Yugoslav and anti-Yugoslav period. And you have been focusing recently on the issue of artistic labor and the status of artistic work in Yugoslav period and in all the periods that followed, let's say. So in your opinion, in what way was the concept and the practice of artistic labor unique in the Yugoslav context?
Yeah, thank you. I also want to thank you for inviting me. I'm always excited to talk about these topics, and it's really great to finally meet Sezgin also, who I know and read, but never have met him personally. So even if it's online, and thank you, Ana and Darija and all the organizers. So yeah, basically, I would say what was interesting about Yugoslavia was that the status of artistic labor was unique in the sense that it was not invisible, at least for, let's say, 25 or 30 years or so. So quite the contrary, there were very explicit laws that were implemented already, some of them in 1946, that guaranteed payment, and then later on in the 50s, they also passed some laws which secured welfare protection for art workers. And that meant, especially for those that were not employed, that is, today we would know them as freelancers, because a number of art workers were actually employed in different arts institutions in Yugoslavia. And what was so interesting in Yugoslavia was, and I think that this is also the crux of the matter or the problem, was that artists also had the autonomy. So this means that art had similar social role as it in general does in the Western or bourgeois societies. So it was treated as a field of professional work, but there was guaranteed payment and guaranteed welfare and social protection. And this coexistence, I think, made Yugoslav situation very particular and unique in that sense, or maybe not necessarily unique, but definitely particular. But these two sides, right, the labor protection, understanding art as labor, and on the other hand, these ideas that are connected with philosophical traditions about what is art in the West, created a tension that then developed. And I can talk more later on about that, but this would be kind of the basic thing that was very interesting in Yugoslavia, was that there was secured payment, artists were treated as workers, and as important members of socialist society that built this society, and that and so that was one interesting thing. And this was all legally pinned with different kinds of laws and regulations that existed. Muted.
Sorry, again. Thank you so much, Katja. And Sezgin, it would be great if you could tell us a little bit more about the background of your research. You also kind of like analyze the roles and functions of art collectives in Yugoslav period, as well as the ones in the post-Yugoslav period. So in your opinion, how would you describe actually the cultural politics of Yugoslavia, and what was the place of collectives in Yugoslav approach to art? So was it like institutionally kind of articulated and imposed, or there was self-organization happening, or both, or how would you analyze this situation?
Well, first of all, hello. Anna, thanks you for inviting to giving this possibility to discuss this very interesting topic, I would say. And also Kuda for creating a platform for this discussion. Actually, today I think most of what I will refer to is a research and article that I published almost 10 years ago. It is published in one academic journal edited by Slobodan Karamanic with Daniel Schubert, and it is dealing with like post-Yugoslavian cultural, let's say, politics, but in a more explicit political terms, and also with the topics that I was addressing, which is like a cultural policy. And I looked in that article how has changed the, let's say, the form of the artistic collectives after 1990s up to especially through 2000s, up to the period when I wrote an article. And now when I read it again, and now when I'm thinking of that days, actually this article, even it is academic article published by Brill, did cause some stir in some circles when it was published, when it was read. And not only because it was addressing some contemporary actors, which was active in contemporary art world, but also when I think now, is like I didn't think about this before, it shows that then this kind of questions regarding contemporary art was taken a bit more seriously than today. So of course, this is a question, what this means. What is the implication of this observation that I have? Maybe I'm wrong. But I think implication is that today, one of the implications is that contemporary art is seen as a completely recuperated and co-opted, like there is nothing to defend in that field, more or less. So, and the activism that is connected to, like the politics that is connected to culture is more shifted toward the activism, which is becoming more and more innovative, I would say, or explicit political expressions. That is one thing that is affirmed in this change today, comparing to 10 years ago, now I'm talking, is that is a theoretical production today is much more serious regarding the art. This is the interesting, like, as much as the market is co-opted, then the reflection to that co-optation is, I would say, more substantial. 10 years ago or up from 90s, throughout the 90s and 2000, when we look at the existing literature on the politics of contemporary art, collectives being part of it, and cultural policy, it's one thing strikes me personally, it's extremely eclectic and bit of like, I would use this bit colloquial term, bit random, arbitrary sort of references and studies. But so today, I think we are in a much more developed situation to talk about these things. And now, today, when I read this text, I think we're gonna talk about that stuff, the topic of today's discussion, but I want to come back to your question that you addressed to Katja and to me as well about like kind of specificity of Yugoslavian cultural production. I think it was quite rich. Like if we just think about like a cultural policy aspect or cultural politics, there was a journal dedicated only to that question called Kulturni radnik, cultural worker, very serious journal. Then there was a journal which is called Kultura, culture. That most of this, what is known as experts of cultural policy in Yugoslavia, including Stevan Majstorović, who incidentally also wrote a report to UNESCO called Cultural Policy in Yugoslavia in this series, also was editing and writing in this journal, and some of the later more known cultural policy researchers like Milena Dragicević-Šešić published her first article in Kultura. By the way, this will be a bit performative. I have one issue with me. I'm in Helsinki now, and this is the issue I took with me when I was last visiting Belgrade. I took it from Baraba bookshop. And it is quite interesting. Like this, what Katja spoke about, like specificity, and I would add also unevenness of the cultural production was so rich. It's like, I took this issue because now I'm working on one topic, which is dealing with concrete poetry in Yugoslavia that appeared in the mass-produced journals. So here, this issue is illustrated by a concrete visual poet called Žarko Rošulj. And the whole issue, which is published in 1971, includes his contributions. He was a part of a signalist project, and as most of the signalist project members of signalism became extreme nationalists already in 80s. He is particularly such. But when you open this journal, when I open now, because the main work, it is Žarko Rošulj's work, it's called Cveće samoupravljanja, the flower of self-management, which is a topic that I guess we cannot avoid today. But when you open this journal and you look at the topics, it's like you have a special topic is religion. The main text is written by Alija Izetbegović, for example. And then you have like discussions on the struggles in the left in literature. and you have all kind of like a really strong, very antagonistic positions. So I think that aspect is quite an important. Like, if anything, it's like important. If nothing, it is important because it shows that culture is understood as a field of struggle. Maybe not as in China, like cultural revolution, but similarly. So that I would really like to give that kind of overall picture about what I think about Yugoslavian culture.
I would like to, how to say, add that I totally agree, right? That this Yugoslavia was really interesting. And I think that especially maybe for people who are not from the post-socialist context that may be listening to this conversation, one of the things that I always have to do when I talk about Yugoslavia is I need to first explain that Yugoslavia was socialist, but it was its own brand of socialism, and that it was not behind the Iron Curtain, right? So that it was in fact between the East and the West, geopolitically speaking, and that it was also the founding member of the non-aligned movement. So it had a very particular situation, which I think also enabled what Sezgin was just saying, this kind of like, the kind of intellectual pluralism. I mean, there were stages and these things changed, but I have to wholeheartedly agree that the production, the support for the art, for culture, was not just for professional art workers and collectives, but it was also for everyday people, right? Because that was the idea. Let's emancipate labor and everyone should have access to culture, not just in terms of enjoying it as viewers or attendees, but also as people who can create, right? So yeah, maybe just that.
But maybe we should, I mean, try to develop this a bit more, because I think that there is a tendency, you know, like I don't know, kind of not always give the whole picture about the art production. So from what we heard now, what we were missing as well is that there was an official art production. So there was like, I don't know, like the film industry, the anti-fascist monuments and parks that were built and created by, let's say, very famous state artists at that time. As well as there was like the amateur production. There was a lot of association of amateur artists that had a chance to experiment, and many of them became later like professional artists, filmmakers, and whatever. I don't know, would you like to both maybe expand a little bit of this and like try to relate this, what you were talking about, to like this like larger picture?
I mean, I think that, so some of these things, you're right? So the whole system of cultural production was very big. There was an enormous investment, for instance, precisely that cultural policy report, cultural policy in Yugoslavia, that was written by Stevan Majstorović. It gives you a great idea of all the things that have happened, because what is impressive is that in 10 years or 15 years after the war, they have built enormous amounts of institutions in Yugoslavia. I mean, that's why we have, I mean, this is still the legacy that we that we inherited in a way, right? Even though that it was really destroyed and so on. But I think, yes, Yugoslavia was very interesting precisely in the sense that culture was accessible, right? That it was protected as professional work, that there was an ability for people to also enjoy, to practice it, this associational culture, right? All the different associations that existed were very important. Numerous, I mean, from dancers to filmmakers actually started their careers in some small towns, in some kino clubs or something like that. And then they became experimental artists and so on and so on. So it was not an elite thing, at least not initially in the beginning. I mean, it became a problem later on for different reasons, but so on. And I think that that's important. And I would even say and want to emphasize that in Yugoslavia, I think it's also very problematic to talk about the state artist and non-state artist. In Yugoslavia, everything was part of the system. You can't escape it. I mean, everything was supported by the state. There was no outside of that, right? So the funding was redistributed through different mechanisms throughout the years. But right, the oppositional views about art and politics and so on were formulated pretty openly, and there was a discussion, like Sezgin pointed out, even in that journal, right? The positions were different, and there was some discussion existed about things. So I think that that's another really interesting aspect of cultural life in Yugoslavia.
Sezgin, would you like to add something on this?
Yeah, I would like to add even further about particularly this journal called Kultura. Like, apart from having this kind of oppositional voices there, some of the most experimental and avant-garde artistic, including conceptual art texts, appeared in Kultura. For example, Art and Language, that I also would like to mention more today. Art and Language writings criticizing the bureaucracy in contemporary art institutions is translated and published in Kultura. Goran Đorđević wrote for Kultura. Then many other, let's say, more like of the left avant-garde have written about many different topics in this journal. So that is interesting that a parallel existence of avant-garde, but I think this does not, it was not seen as a contradiction, because it was seen as very well fitting to the idea of what self-management was understood by the socialist theoreticians and activists. It was seen as like an integral system, which means it can absorb, and it should absorb, anything, any sort of cultural activity. So it was not, which means self-management was not understood only as an economical reorganization of a socialist system. It was not what today was called economistic deviation. It was understood primarily as a political, but because it implies a lot of changes in a humankind, which was unforeseen under that conditions that was Yugoslavia before. So it really included a lot of cultural change, a lot of subjective transformation. So I agree very much with writings, and I took it as a let's say, orientation in my art work on artistic histories in 70s and 80s of work done by theoreticians like Slobodan Karamanić, further on took by Srećko Pulić, which I highly recommend their writings on self-management in active. I think active is not anymore active. And also Gal Kearns writings and all these theoretical writings that developed around journal like Prelom and such. So what is interesting in that position is that self-management was seen, the effects of self-management was measured through that subjective transformation, which were seen as an integral, not through that sociological, statistical objective, like how many percentage of things happened, how much successful it was. Of course, that is to be looked at, sure, but that qualitative transformation, I think, is especially more important for us who are dealing with artistic theories and artistic forms. So regarding let's say this, when we talk like subjective effects of that integral self-management, actually this was not an abstract effect. It was very concrete. And one example is that I use it very much reading it, and I recommend to everybody, I find out about it through a text of Srećko Pulić, is an article published in 1976 called Radnici, kultura, revolucija, Workers, Culture, Revolution. Conversations with Workers. It was done by Ivan Jakopović and published in Zagreb, in Zavod za kulturu in 76. It's huge book, almost 500 pages, discussion with the workers from the different factories. You can download it from memory of the, what is called memory of the world, yes?
Memory of the world, yeah. I just wanted to say.
Yes. This, you know what, this is the best project. It's like, so anyway, what you see there, for example, a discussion with like a workers working in the pharmaceutical company Pliva, factory in Pliva in Zagreb. And you can see like how workers were talking about art, how they were talking about culture and all these things. It was actually really meant something for them, not some addendum or some sort of recreational or some sort of like a, let's say, a side effect of their labor, but they were seeing like everything as a very creative, very, very sort of collective. And it's like I think this testimony of these interviews, it is very, very much showing clearly, concretely what meant that subjective effects of self-management. So yeah, we can also go that, but what Katja said, there were many amateur artists who turned into professional artists, like many experimental filmmakers we can mention. Like I did my PhD on Dusan Makavejev, and what especially I have focused on was Makavejev's involvement in various cultural organizations prior to making professional films. He did a lot of amateur films, this kind of Esperanto influence, BT American underground films. They are not so good as a film, but the idea is very interesting. And then he been participating in many discussions of the status of film, of art, and how youth is, how film should be presented to youth, to the schools, and that already shows that the art has been from the beginning measured through that collective effect, through that sort of collective understanding, I think.
Thank you, Sezgin, both of you. And Katja, I mean, Yugoslavia was a very dynamic formation. So there is this tendency to kind of see it very monolithically, but there was like different experiments, attempts to, I don't know, resolve specific issues that were emerging in the field of, I don't know, work, organizing, and many other culture as well. So how would you describe, you wrote a lot about these transformations that were happening in the 70s and this kind of like twist towards entrepreneurship in the art. So what exactly happened? Can you give us a little bit more detail to understand? I mean, also this number of cultura that Sezgin was speaking about emerged from that period. So this is the kind of effect of 70s.
Yeah, well, you know, so I'm not a historian, I'm a sociologist, right? But still, I totally agree. Like, yeah, Yugoslavia had different periods, and when you read people like, I would add to the list that Sezgin pointed out, there's also like Unkovski Korica, and there's a bunch of really interesting new scholarship. Bojana Videkanic wrote a book on non-alignment, and so there's a lot of people who write now about Yugoslavia and analyze it and point out that there are different periods, right? One of the ways that I approached what happened with labor was that I divided it in 3 central periods. So the first one I said was the making of art workers, which would be immediately after the war, so 1945 to somewhere 52. This is where they started to experiment with this idea of art as workers, where they started to implement some kind of regulation for artists to be paid, socially protected. And then the largest and interesting part was then this expansion of art as labor, as I call it, or like testing the limits of how far can art be considered as labor. And that was somehow between 1952 to 74. And then in 74 to the end, I call that period the unmaking of art workers, right? And this is the period you're asking me about, right? So if the first two periods had these different types of regulation, and there were tensions because of the conflict between, you know, the Western ideas of art and the ideas that Sezgin also just mentioned now, right? Workers doing creative work, everyone having access to culture. So there was some kind of tension. And in the 70s, what happened was that you already felt the effects of the economic reform. The economic reform in Yugoslavia took place around 65. Don't quote me on it, maybe it was 63, but somewhere there. And that economic reform meant that they started to implement market principles, not necessarily because they took them in a little bit, I would say, in a naive way, perhaps. And so this marketization became something that then drove different kinds of trends. And then in 73, there was the oil crisis, the global crisis. And because Yugoslavia was very much linked to the East and especially to the West support, this really impacted its economy, right? And so they started to implement more of these market principles in all areas of economy. And these things then also eventually creeped into the arts. So while you had these laws that were nominally called laws for independent artists or independent cultural workers, and these laws happened really late, towards the end of 70s and actually early 80s. What happened is in these laws was that the principle of social security was not anymore taken for granted, but it was really tightly linked to the idea of merit, right? So if you are an artist who is good enough, who has certain kinds of credentials, then you become entitled to social security. And for the people who work in the form, in this post-socialist context and that are familiar with this status of artist or status of cultural worker, they will know what I'm talking about, because when they apply for such a status, even today in Slovenia or in Croatia, they need to demonstrate certain kind of accomplishments in the arts. And if a committee decides that that is good enough, then they get a subsidy, right? But in Yugoslavia at the beginning, even though those laws had that element, this was not the case. People really got this social security on pretty general terms. And so in the 70s, that's what started to happen, is that the idea of art and merit-based access to social security started to transform these workers into entrepreneurs, because they had to start to compete, not only for the money to create their projects, but also for their welfare. And so what happened was in the 70s that then I would say the class stratifications happened, because you had artists who were employed in art institutions, or you had art workers also, not just artists, right? So also curators, other cultural workers who were employed, and their security was kind of stable. The freelancers were less and less stable. And that is something that was happening throughout the 70s. And then I can talk more about it later when we talk about concrete examples of artists who kind of had an issue with that, right? Because you could see that the artists are kind of like the weakest link within this art system, and that they are becoming exploited. Because the shield of welfare protection was still kind of operating, they were not paying so much attention to it, but this underlying tension was already there. And so in the 80s, it was a total, that's where the crash, I would say, happened, is when these laws were then implemented. And in many nation states that followed socialist Yugoslavia, such as Slovenia and Croatia, these laws still exist in different formats and still regulate right support for the artists. And I, for instance, right, because I live in US now, and the US people, this is great, right? They have support. But in comparison to what was before, the history, this is a degradation, right? Because it's not more universally acceptable to be an artist and to be able to make a living, but you need to compete. And so that is that's what happened in the 70s. So that these ideas started to be implemented, and because even the constitution itself, right, the 1974 constitution of Yugoslavia officially implemented the self-management and this idea of free exchange of labor. And so everyone would be exchanging labor, and there were contracts and so on and so on. But because of this geopolitical situation and the pressures on Yugoslav economy, these ideas were really becoming more and more problematic. And I think that the whole neoliberal rationality or neoliberal policies were not necessarily critiqued to an extent that we can critique them from today's point of view.
Thank you. Thank you, Katja, so much for this. And Sezgin, are you there, or he disappeared? Okay, Katja, but maybe you can now tell us a little bit about these examples that you mentioned, and then we will go back to Sezgin.
Yeah, so it's interesting that because of these, let's say, pretty good conditions and the general welfare that was available or that existed in Yugoslavia, of course, the payment was not the first topic of discussion. Of course, after 65 and this economic reform, the process of commodification started, and there's an interesting book by, the name escapes me, who talks about, the commodification in the field of culture. And so issues of commodification, of market and so on have been discussed, right? But they were not necessarily linked to the arts. But the two examples that I have found and that I think were really interesting when we talk about the problem of artistic labor and payment and so on. One was Goran Đorđević, who was a Belgrade-based artist and who worked in this circle of artists who belonged to the new art practice, so-called new art practice in Yugoslavia. That was late 60s and 70s. And he was connected to this circle of people who worked in the Student Cultural Center in Belgrade. But he was always a kind of an outsider, because the first thing he did was he said, like, well, he had an issue with the idea of creativity. He says, like, what does that mean, right? And he wrote many interesting texts. Some of them are actually available in English. One is on the class character of art, which was published in the journal that was that was collectively organized by art and language people. There were only 3 issues, and in one issue he published this text on class character of art, but it's also available in Croatian, in Serbo-Croatian or Serbian or whatever you want to say it. So he had an issue with creativity because he said that only a deity, right, a god can create. People work, research, do other things. They don't, because creation means that something is created out of nothing, right? And that's something that is a problem. And so he criticized that term and linked it to religion and talked about that. And said that art is in fact an illusion, right? That we have these illusions that there is this creative artist who's usually a white man, right, it has like godlike characters. But in fact, artists need to eat, live, pay their bills, so on and so on and so on. So they are conditioned by the reality in which they create, even though culturally they are represented as exceptional beings, being creative and so on and so on. And so he took issue with that. The other thing that he derived from that was that it is precisely this idea of creativity that also causes the exploitation of the artists within the system of Western art, right? So that within the system, you have artists, you have critics, art historians, curators, museum directors, I mean, also in other fields of art, these are similar structures. And in this structure, he said, right, artist is really the weakest link, because they all depend on the idea that artist is creative, that artist is the one that creates the artwork, but in fact, the entire system, in fact, establishes it and its value. And so what he suggested after all this analysis was that the artists should go on strike. And that they should strike because they need to change the relations of production, they should have control of their labor, because at that time already in Yugoslavia and abroad, that was not the case, and it's still not the case today, right? So others control this labor, and others have way more power than the artist himself. And so what he did was he sent out a letter, and I can show you this if I can share my screen, because I found this, let me see. You need to enable me to share my screen, but then when you do, I can share this. So he wrote an invitation, not only to Yugoslav artists, but also to a number of international artists abroad, mostly conceptual artists, the artists that he already assumed would, you know, take part in that. Okay, so let me see if I can share it now. Yes, I can. Here we go. And so share. So for instance, this is a response, but I'm gonna try to, let me do something. Where is it? Here we go. So these are responses from artists, but this is the letter that he sent. So he asked them, right, would you take part in an international strike of artists as a protest against art system's unbroken repression of the artists and the alienation from the results of his practice? It would be very important to demonstrate a possibility of coordinating activity independent from art institutions and organize an international strike of artists. And so he invited people and asked them, hey guys, should we do this? Can we do this? And so the response was in fact pretty mild. So he got about 40 responses, and some of them I'll show you now. So this is, for instance, one example of a response. And some people were for this strike. This is, for instance, a response from, who's this? I forgot. Is it?
Buren.
Yeah. And so then we have Hans Hake responded. This is a long letter by Lucy Lippard, Vito Acconci. So a number of artists, oops, that's the next example. A number of artists responded. Either, yes, some said that they're already on strike because they are boycotting the art institution. Some said, okay, we don't think this is a good strategy. We think that, you know, we need to survive. And when I talked to him when I was writing this book that is going to be published now next year in English, the artwork, Invisible Labor and the Legacy of Yugoslav Socialism, he told me that it was interesting because he had the feeling that the people who came from abroad, from capitalist countries, found it really odd. They said, like, this can be a proposal from somebody who is economically not dependent on these institutions, right? And I think that is what was really progressive in these stances that he had, was that he, on a certain extent, realized that there is a certain kind of protection for artists and art workers. And so that there's a room for this kind of rebellion. But it didn't happen. The strike eventually didn't happen. And what he concluded was that, you know, that it was more of a utopian wish than, in fact, an actual possibility. But I think it was really interesting in terms of all other things that he did and articulated about art and artistic labor, of how, how this call for strike actually makes it really visible. In what way the artists are exploited because they perceive themselves as creators rather than workers, and why this kind of perception of art as labor is important as long as we are under the spell of compulsion to work and to work to live. And so I think that that's one interesting example. But it was really confrontational, right? It was like boycott, strike, we are not going to do it. And that always puts people in different, I think, as a strategy, it's problematic because like he said, even the artists from the West were like, well, we can't afford this, right? We need to somehow make it happen. But then the other example, which was perhaps more pragmatic, but still critical, I think, came from the artists who were connected with around Podrum. They were based in Zagreb, Podrum, which could be translated as underground for the international non-Serbo-Croatian speaking people. So it was a gallery that was initially a working space of Dalibor Martinis, and then Sanja Iveković joined, and a bunch of other people, again, important or more or less renowned conceptual artists. And they also perceived a problem, right, of this exploitation. But what they did is that they proposed to have a contract, so that artists should have a contract when they work with an institution. And so this is, they published all this in a journal, which was called Prvi broj, or first issue. It was unfortunately only one, there was only one first issue. And in this first issue, especially Sanja Iveković and Dalibor Martinis were really into this topic of making a contract between the artist and the galleries, and they try to really specify how this should work. And what they did, right? So they wanted also to, so this is the contract itself. I'm not sure if you guys can actually see, but again, these things are also available online. So anyone can access it and go and look at it. But you know, like they specified everything from who is responsible for what. They also, of course, specified who should be paid for what kind of labor, and so on and so on. So these are 2 pages of this contract. It's on these digitizing ideas, where you have a number of different documents from Yugoslavia, where you can access this. So, right, this, and what was interesting with Podrum was that they kind of used the terminology of self-management and free exchange of labor. They said, okay, so if in Yugoslavia we have this many arts institutions and this many people interested in the arts, it means that art is socially valuable. And so we need to actually then value it as such also in economic terms, right? And so, and that's what they kind of suggested. And in order to demonstrate why this is a problem, they made another interesting comparison that I'm gonna show. I hope I can, here it is. So in this same first issue, they published a chart. And this chart demonstrated that distinction that I talked about earlier between people who were employed, right? So we have it here, I don't know, here it's on my left side. You have radnik u kulturi, which means an employee in the cultural organization. And on the other side, you have independent artists. And so they made a comparison. If they both earn 10,000 Yugoslav dinars, what are they covering with that funds, right? And so it was really interesting because, of course, if you are an employee, as is very common today, the employer covers a number of your healthcare insurance, social security, and so on and so on. I mean, it is also very common that the employee has to give some share of his gross income, but here it was not. And so on the other side, you had this independent artist, right, who got 10,000 dinars as well. But then he had taxes on on his honorarium. Then they need to cover the expenses of working space. And it was everything: rent, electricity, heating, blah, blah, blah. Then you need to cover your health insurance. You need to cover your vacation, right? The materials for work, communication, anyway, administration, travel expenses, and then in the end you see 12 means ostalo, means the rest. 150 is no, actually I'm sorry, that's the rest means miscellaneous. But at the end, what the art worker was left with was way less than the employee, right? Because artist has all these expenses because he doesn't have an organization where they work in. And so they use this as a comparison to make a point, right? Why artists need to be paid, and that there should be some kind of negotiation between what the galleries cover and what they don't cover, and so on and so on. So, but again, right, my main question was, when I talked to both to Dalibor Martinis and to Sanja Iveković, was like, why didn't this contract, why was it not implemented? And apparently there was not enough they didn't gain enough traction, so they didn't use it. Again, for instance, Dalibor Martinez told me that he used it once when he was invited to be the artist for like a Venice Biennial, but that was already after Yugoslavia. So when he was a Croatian artist, so he was able to use this contract that one time. But in general, the artists and the institutions, they didn't really, there was not a critical mass who would support this kind of work. I think it's interesting as a proposal, and we see it even today. For instance, in US, there's a collective called Wage, and they don't advocate for a contract necessarily, but they advocate for minimum fees. So every time you work for an art institution, you should understand your work as a service for the institution, and you should be paid for. So it's kind of like a similar principle. But of course, wages model is also based on Canadian model. So in Canada, you have an organization called CARFAC, which also promotes paying the artists. And so these things are, you know, there are artists who understand why, again, it is important to collectively understand yourself as worker if you want to survive in this system, right? Even if we all want to abolish capitalism and wage labor, emancipate labor, I think that there are steps to that, and that these are two interesting examples. So maybe I should stop talking now because I've been talking for a long time.
Thank you so much, Katja. And Sezgin, could you tell us, please, what was the status of self-management, let's say, in the institutional collectives and in this kind of like self-organized collectives that emerged in the, can you hear me? Yeah. I don't know where was I. I will repeat everything. So I'm interested in the status of self-management within the institutional setting, within these self-organized groups, and how this status of self-management changed in the so-called process of the transition that we can track maybe from 60s or 70s or 80s, whatever you prefer, and wherever you see this neurological moment in time.
Well, first of all, to come back to this question of like when the, let's say, like a financialization of self-management took like a more, like a serious shape, which is like a mid-60s and onwards. Of course, it's like a economical aspect took a more like say visibility in self-management than the political and this subjective aspect that I mentioned. And now the question is, did that transformation influence negatively art or not? Is something we have to like ask to ourselves. But when we ask to ourselves, we always have to think that the artistic reasoning of the society of what, or the external factors are rather different than how sociologists and the politicians are doing. So I think like when we look at the political aspect of this very leftist arts, also we have to understand from the art point of view. Like, of course, self-management has influenced everything. As I said, it was expected to influence everything, every sector. It was seen as an integral process. But what I think it was meant to really do as an influence is that the artwork really has to be seen as a work, which means as a process, not as an end product, as an object, as a commodification. So from the commodity to move to a production. And now, socialist, let's say, theory and the practice, and communist theory and practice is rich regarding the art of these references, of shifting the artwork from the consumption to production. And this is not only of what socialists were seeing as a cultural politics, as like a cultural revolution or artistic revolution, but also this is what every artist are hoping to gain, because no artist that I know would like to see her or his work as reduced to an object, and herself and himself to a person who produced the objects. Like, no artist want to be objectified in this artwork. That's for sure. So, and every artist is, of course, especially since the avant-garde, because after the October Revolution, after the 1917, and the similar tendencies were in Europe, especially in Germany after 1919 and 1920, the idea was that the art was seen as a production. So all these writings of Arvatov, of like a Russian constructivist, of certain artists who were not necessarily political, like for example, Kazimir Malevich, but who were seeing that the real value of their work is actually in that process, in that sort of production, in that thinking. And the platform given by, like a concrete platform given by the communist institutions, Soviet institutions, were making these approaches more visible. So these are like concrete historical moments. And of course, in Yugoslavia during self-management, theoreticians were looking at that experiences, and that experiences were rich because they were looking, for example, in Germany, if not necessarily only in Russia. In Germany in 1920s and 1930s, what is called as a new sobriety, this kind of Dadaism turned to new realism. We can, like, from Georg Gross to Hartfield, all these artists and the legion of the theoreticians who were involved in that, they were practically asking that question. The practical question was how to save art, avant-garde art, from the hands of art market. Every avant-garde artist, no matter how much they were reclaiming for the autonomy of the art, they were asking this question of art market. Now I'm working on a project we actually are finalizing. We translate, there is a Serbo-Croatian translation, but we are doing first English translation of Karel Teige, for example, famous Czech avant-gardist. In 1936, he wrote a text called Art Market. And many, if you look, there are so many. And so in Yugoslavia, from the 50s onwards, there was like people who were concretely, let's say, they were themselves involved in that platforms in 20s and 30s in Germany, who were making the new cultural politics. One person that is not mentioned often, because usually when these things are discussed, you could hear like a Yugoslav surrealists, and I would say deservedly so, but also there was other people that were not in this kind of surrealistic mini-school groupings in 20s and 30s, but more in this leftist artist avant-garde. And one person that I really think we should somehow work on his trajectory is Otto Bihaly-Merin. For example, Otto Bihaly-Merin, he wrote a book in 1950s, or I think beginning of 60s, Art in Germany Between Two World Wars. And that was meant that this is where we are looking. And he was instrumental in most of these journals or institutions of this kind of idea that now we have concrete platforms to realize. Incidentally, Otto Bihaly-Merin, who actually is known also to with his work on amateur art or naive art or outsider art, but he wrote also about the conceptual art, published a huge text in Treći program and in many other places, and also about avant-garde art and especially political aspects of those. So he was incidentally also influential to Goran Đorđević to get in touch with a conceptual artist or new art practice, artist of new art practice tendencies in Students' Cultural Center in beginning of 1970. So, I mean, this kind of a concrete intersections are something that I'm interested myself now to look more, because this didn't happen out of blue sky. There are few really concrete institutions, concrete subjectivities who people with like with a very strong will were pushing forward. So it would be interesting to map those and to make it more, I would say, a really historical materialist picture of what actually was happening during that time. By the way, Otto Bihaili-Merin is a person who also, just to tell this, who in 1930s initiated the Institute of Studying Fascism in Paris. And it is in that institution where Walter Benjamin, which he organized, to give a lecture called Author as Producer, which, as you know, it was like it was looking in which way the artistic work can oppose fascism, as was his project throughout the 30s. So like Otto Bihaili-Merin and then the other concrete, let's say, journals, institutions is something that I particularly like to look at, and not to avoid because previously I think I have done a lot of big shortcuts, of avoiding, of like missing to see like the caterpillars of that artistic thoughts, of that artistic positions. Also regarding this Goran Đorđević International Artist Strike, I saw that somebody posted this Stuart Holmes. He also made a book from the Neoist position, Art Strike, and many others did. Gustav Metzger, many other artists wanted to initiate Art Strike. And by the way, it is interesting, this work of Goran Đorđević actually is published for the first time in a journal called 3+4. It was a journal published in Belgrade or by students of art history department. I got it original last time when I was in Belgrade, and very good price. I don't have it here with me. But the Goran Đorđević is an interesting case. Interesting case because in the work of Goran Đorđević, especially I would say in his work, we can really trace and see that caterpillars, that very rich artistic reasoning of that theoretical production, you know? And his major influence was Kazimir Malevich. And regarding the creativity and the art and the religion that he wrote in The Fox, published as The Class Character of Art, his theory was there that art, if it's seen from the religious point of view, is a creativity, but we don't want that. We want a secular art. And his understanding of secular art is that nowadays artists cannot create, because it is, God can do that, God already did the most beautiful things. So what we, humankind, can do, we can use art as a research. We can use art as a research, which is also reflecting the same self-management, integral self-management idea of removing creativity or removing the cultural production from the consummation. So this is the idea. And Goran Đorđević took that position to the extreme. And also this, when he published, I think this was 1980, late 70s or 1980. And this has a prehistory. This is a prehistory, which is Yugoslav leftist conceptual artist relationship to art and language. It's very much interesting because it was not only Yugoslav conceptual artists' interest to conceptual art, interest to art and language, because art and language has a particular, let's say, a position within all this understanding of art of 70s. What is that? The question of collectivity, which is exactly our topic. For art and language, the collectivity is not something which is the uniform language, which is the manifesting language of one art group. This is not a univocal declaration of some sort of position. Collectivity means what it always has to be, a conflict of many opposing positions. So in art and language, what actually they wanted to make their art practice to be consists of was the conversation. And conversations are never easy. Conversations always involve many opposing statements and opposing positions. So what they did actually, all their practice with the indexing project actually is based on that assumption, like how we can, in fact, picture that opposition. And so I think their merit is in that. Like when you read their writings through which was published in Art Language and later in The Fox, what you can see there is like a very antagonistic, very oppositional, and kind of very counter narrative toward existing artistic discourses, but also within their own group. And by the way, the only, let's say, a historical document which is made from somebody outside of art and language depicting that antagonistic layers is Zoran Popović video, Borba u New York, Struggle in New York, that he visited New York as a guest of art and language, and particularly Joseph Kossuth, who was a part of art and language, and recorded all these things, which is what? They are just fighting among each other. So this aspect of that socialist collectives, and this is conceptual art or like a leftist avant-garde art collectives, is something that I contradict with the second collectives of like after 90s and 2000, which the collectives is seen as a univocal, as a non-contradictory, as is somehow in one text that I refer to as bit like a managerial, and ultimately that can be seen as collectives that are not so much into this processual productivist, but more consuming, sort of like NGO style, how we can finish certain project, how we can finalize the project, and what is the next project, you know, like that kind of like collectives was not what during the self-management times some artistic collectives are seeing their work to be. And I can talk if it's like if more about it.
More of how you see this change from self-management to management in the process of transition. I mean, how this actually emerged? What happened to collectives? Why did this second type of collective?
Yeah, I mean, of course, one reason is that because there was like no socialism anymore, no self-management, and like what I try to also explain in this text that I mentioned in the beginning of my talk is that this is the discourse, this is the ideology of contemporary art today. It is like a institutional logic of a contemporary art, institutional logic of collectives in contemporary art. And I named a few influences, like particularly Maria Lind, perhaps on some certain level, Charles Esche and others, writings influenced by Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau's understanding of agonism and sort of friendly enemies living together. So, you know, all this shift to this more like that would be impossible now to make like in few minutes to explain how that shift happened, but this shift happened already in 80s, started, and already in the 80s happened so that the question of identity became part of this discourse. Question of identity through Mouffe and Laclau, but also the idea of a populism, just to mention few, let's say, subtopics of this big general transformation. But I mean, these things were very much denunciation I did myself. A lot of these authors that I mentioned earlier, that I see as in my, let's say, theoretical orientation in studying self-management, we did a lot, and many I didn't mention. Denunciation we do always. But what I want to say, and what I interest me now, that is my project that I wish to more seriously to work on it in the following years, is that during the 80s, when this, let's say, shift toward this Laclau, agonism, post-Marxism, Eurocommunism was happening, then there was a big reaction also inside the Yugoslavia. Of course, there was main theoreticians like today that is known, Žižek, Maštnak, Dolar, partly even Moćnik, like I'm talking about Slavoj Žižek, Mladen Dolar, Tomasz Maštnak, and Rastko Moćnik were very much, in fact, working on that idea of like bringing civil society as a socialist concept. This was the result of the influence of Laclauian, Mouffian misreading of Gramsci, and this understanding of hegemony as some other form of a civil society, which was for the socialist theoretician, because civil society exactly is where the bourgeoisie is the most strong in some, if we can say that they have some sort of theory. But there was the opposition. There was a very concrete opposition, and these are what I am intending to look at. From 80s, you have opposition to these streams and very serious research. I mean, when I mentioned to you, of course, people's hair would go like this when I say, for example, Stipe Šuvar wrote a theoretical text opposing Laclau and the Mouffe thesis already in 87, pardon. And because today the general tendency is that to see that figures that were involved in socialist institutions as just like apparatchiks, lacking any kind of theoretical abstraction and conceptualization, is something we really have to oppose. They had a thought, they were constantly thinking, and those people who were also in the institutions, they were not any people, they were people who perhaps fought against fascists or were actively involved in building with the nails that socialism. So we are talking about people who had quite militant subjectivity, you know. These were not people who were sort of managing the ad hoc situation, the contingency. Through the financialization of market reforms in 1965, of course, then many new technocrat economists, like more middle-class bourgeois sector, also emerged, and they did also influence the art. Like if you look writings and the works and the understanding of the art made by new tendencies, published in Bit International, Bit Internațională, which was in Zagreb, new tendency like more technological, information-based art. This was completely only made possible because of that financialization after the market, financialization of self-management after the market reform in 65. It's a direct link. And that link can be seen also in the form of the art which was produced. Dehumanized art, the very concrete art that is opposed to abstraction, that is minimizing the social factor, minimizing the external influence. That's the main merits of the new tendency approach, which now I am studying through this visual poetry and concrete poetry. So it is no wonder that most of the artists immediately in 80s turned to a right wing, if not very anti-communist for sure, but if not in very nationalistic kind of like tendencies, you know? So like, I mean, it was very, very rich. A lot of different influences, small kind of, and that unevenness, I think this, let me use this thing, that combined an uneven development of a socialist self-management Yugoslavia was something that I think we should look at it. And I think in that bedrock, in that sort of platform, there were like artists, where there were the real possibilities of the artists' experimentations. Yeah, that's like a sort of, I mean, that's my position, how I think it today, and I would really kind of want to make it more into like a research project. One thing that I did last year that I should mention concretely, one step, is an exhibition on art and language in Yugoslavia, because it is interesting. Art and language members from New York came to Belgrade in 1975. They were Michael Corris, Jill Breakston, and Andrew Menard, three of them. And they were doing the Fox journal. And they came to Yugoslavia to talk with the Yugoslav conceptual artists who were mostly operating active inside the Students' Cultural Center, but also in the Museum of Contemporary Art. And because the Fox did not publish only Goran Đorđević, also they published text by Jasna Tjardović and Zoran Popović. And Jasna Tjardović text about self-management and art, I think. Anyway, so they came to Yugoslavia in 1975, and they did in October 1 week of like an intensive conversation with the local artists, which was taped, transcribed, and worked, that was the practice of art and language, worked on indexing, which is to sort of mapping how this group, despite all the contradictions they have among each other, still are together. What is keeping them and what is pushing them? This was like their index of that concatenations that they were talking, like closeness of not concatenation. And in Yugoslavia, this is a big influence. What was very interesting is that texts of art and language start to appear in sociological journals. For example, in Gledišta, in Kultura, and some theoreticians of self-management, one especially called Žarko Papić, who wrote Some upravljanje I inteligencija, self-management and intellectuals. He wrote a chapter on art in self-management, particularly basing his theoretical frame on writings of art and language, especially of Mel Ramsden, because he wrote this text called On Practice, which I think is still fresh text, published in the Fox, appeared in Serbian translation as Bureaucracy and Culture. I think very appropriate renaming. And so it was the influence. This is the interesting moment that artistic writings, the artistic reasoning of their own practice spilled over to a non-artistic, let's say, institutions. This is like one sociologist writing about the let's say, the role of the artist in self-management. This is something, I would say, one example, even if it's one example, which distorts the existing narrative, this is enough. We have to hang on that. By the way, I found about this accidentally because I was doing a research in Magba. They have a huge archives on art and language, and I saw a letter of Zoran Popovic to Mel Ramsden where he explains, oh, by the way, your theories are influencing also sociologists and something like that. So I traced this book, which is quite interesting. And last year I did an exhibition in Museum of Contemporary Art in Ljubljana, which is called Portrait of Yugoslavia in the Style of Art and Language. And there I looked in which way this encounter actually is an encounter of a fight, of a real confrontation. I mean, somebody could now say to me like, well, this is like Chantal Mouffe's idea of agonism, but it was rather more radical and a more extreme and impatient, I would say, in their declarations. And I used the extensive archival material of Michael Corris and from Getty Institute, which is transcripts of that conversations that when you read, there is really so many different positions, different like perspectives of how they understood, let's say, heuristic value of art, role of collectives and all these things. So further on, I want to look at more at that kind of like this sort of encounters which spoil the picture. And on the other hand, this also transformed Western artists. And the main overall, let's say, a project of art and language was this visit of Yugoslavia was part of their overall project of culture and imperialism. And they were kind of looking at a socialist third world and trying and learning from there about like a reorganization of their cultural practices. And when they went back to US, they did an exhibition, and I think that was the last exhibition before they split. It was called Organization of Culture Under Self-Management Socialism. Such an academic stupid title, but that was the title of their exhibition. And it's like in the exhibition I did, you can, I see somebody put a link. You can also see some of the pictures from there that I use the extensive archive material. And that another very interesting aspect of that, when I looked in this material, is the participation of female artists, which otherwise conceptual artist is seen as a ghetto, like a men's world, and all this kind of like, because it was intellectual, theoretical art. But unlike in the Western world, and when we look at one particular, which is not successful art, this is not an art which has been, let's say, a successful, because there was not an object to exhibit. It was that process. They never did any exhibition in Yugoslavia. And also the exhibition they did in US, it was heuristic, sort of like a didactic exhibition that you can learn something. So there was not an object, there was not this, what art and language would have, this index files and like a beautifully designed tables and all this stuff. None of that. That I did for the first time for the museum. But for them, all this art was the subjective, the discussion, the thinking about their own practice. So, and there when you see, actually there was quite even, if not more, definitely equal amount of women and female and male artists active in this, involved in this project. So that's also something to look at. Maybe like everything is changing. That's like, because it's so integral to all segments of society.
Thank you, Sezgin, for adding all of this, like very important history. And many of these things I didn't know before. I'm very much looking forward to look deeper into this. And there are also some questions, but let's leave them for the end if we have time. What I kind of like aimed when I asked Sezgin this question is that he might be willing to talk and reflect, which he exactly did for a bit, about this process, about this paradigmatic, let's say, art collectives that emerged in the period of so-called transition. And in his article, he actually describes these paradigmatic collectives as not any more artistic collectives, but the collectives of those that were managing artists. And that was a specific kind of change in the history of collectives in this period. And I think this is also very important to reflect on this, let's say, logic of denunciation. We were all, I guess, involved in this kind of, in production of this kind of narratives, because the historical moment was quite different at that point. And if we want to talk in deep about this, we also talk about the process of culturalization of politics, what was actually the space of art and culture opening and for discussions, and how this all changed now. I mean, you both said something about that previously. Anyway,
I wanted to add something, because I think I really appreciated that Sezgin brought up all these historical avant-gardes and the context, which I totally agree is really important. And I think that is something that the Western art history has a lot to do with, because I think that the Western art history treats historical avant-garde as a style, rather than treating it as an attack on the bourgeois institution of art. And all these people that he brought up and that worked in Germany and were Yugoslav artists that were then involved in the cultural politics of Yugoslavia, and why art was understood as labor, or why they were even developing all these different things, are extremely important. And I think another one that goes into along those lines and is connected to the new tendencies that are the people around Exact 51, right? They talked about, you know, that we should abolish the distinction between the arts and art and life, and so on and so on. And another thing that I would like to add is that it is very important to emphasize that Goran Đorđević's position was very singular. That even though all those conceptual artists were critical of capitalism, they were not critical of the institution of art. The only one that was critical of the institution of art was Goran Đorđević. And that's why he's an outsider. That's why he made such a radical gesture. He never perceived himself as an artist, and he also doesn't do art anymore, right? And so on. So it is important to understand that part of the critical intellectuals were not really radical enough in terms of implementing this idea of self-management. And this is where they also had a conflict, for instance, with people like Steve Schubert that Sezgin mentioned, because Schubert said, like, we have created this society, but we have not really educated our generations in real critical, historical materialist criticism, right? So this does not mean that now the art needs to be propaganda as like in socialist realism, but that we need to consider material relations and what kind of material relations we are in, and what kind of ideologies they perpetuate. So I think that Schubert was really interesting in that sense, because he was really critical. And you also had like, a lot of people talking about the bourgeois tendencies. And even Goran Đorđević wrote another text, which was called The New Tradition, Nova Tradicija, is where he criticized his own colleagues because he took distance from them, because they were not interested in abolishing or transforming art. They were interested in a different kind of art, right? And so I think that that is a direct line also to this, what Sezgin calls the how do you call it? The second, the first collectives and the second? Is that the, I'm sorry if I'm misusing.
No, that's it.
But that
it's
is
fine. It's look, I forget to mention something. This is not so related to our topic, but it's also part of, like, let's say, I think all of us, we are thinking about it, like international art strike.
Yeah.
Goran Đorđević tried to initiate, and there are many others who had tried to initiate. I was thinking since March this year, because of this pandemic, there is the best ever, let's say, conjuncture to have an international art strike. But contrary to, because we are forced to, but there are no exhibitions, or let's say, there are no exhibitions in a way that were. But still, when you look at the attempts, when you look at today's contemporary art world, is this desperate attempt to, even in this situation of a global crisis, of unprecedented global crisis, attempt to act like before, attempt to act like always, you know? So this is something of, like, what I start initially to maybe to talk about, like, of like today's level of a co-optation in contemporary art institutions are comparing to 10 years ago, 20, even before, it's like, it's a quite big. So no, I was joking with my friends, like, why people are not doing why there is no strike now, because you can do now, but still everybody is like, just want to be like in the old times, you know, missing this exploitative, mafia-like, very oppressive, chauvinistic, whatnot, private art gallery institutions. Like,
but not just private. Let's be clear, not just
private. Yeah, okay.
But
initially goes into that. Yeah.
Public institutions are exactly the same. There's a, you know, in Slovenia, in the rest of the countries that inherited socialist Yugoslavia, it's very common. I mean, and I think that it's also, my understanding is like, right, how do you organize, I mean, or how can artists really defy that kind of system, right? Because like this, you know, that there's another text we can, I mean, like, we could talk about this Goran Đorđević for 3 days, I think.
Let's do. I'm for it.
Yeah, me too. And the avant-gardes, because I think, like, oh my God, the whole historical avant-gardes and how they're interpreted in the West is, to me, mind-boggling in terms of their attack on the institution. But so Đorđević wrote another text where he said that the artist is actually a pseudo-subject, pseudo-subject, he called him. And so it's really interesting because he says that, that the artists, they don't have the power really, right? Because of the structure that is implemented. So I think that it's also very hard to put it on the artists to rebel, right? Because you would think that the other components of this system which benefit from this kind of setup, the religious setup of creativity and exceptionality, they benefit. So that's it's a real issue of what are today the struggles, right? Is really strike, it's very effective in terms of what it does if artists go on strike. But at the same time, right, like there's beyond that. I think it's also a conversation about what do we mean when we talk about artistic labor? And that's why I'm also interested in that aspect, right? And I think that if you look through the art and conceptual art from this point of view of art as labor, then you also see this splintering of positions, right? Is where some people are for exceptionality. And for instance, they were really another person who wrote an interesting thing that you probably will be interested is Zagorka Golubovic wrote a really interesting text about a culture between utopia and reality or something like that. and she was very critical about, you know, how artists perceive themselves within socialism, and what is the problem of this idea of emancipation of humanity, of human emancipation, and these ideas that kind of promoted were promoted or were kind of the philosophical groundings of self-management to a certain extent, even if they went awry for many reasons, is, I think, really interesting, right? How do we think about these things? Like, it's a self-criticism that I think we also need to practice in terms of, right?
No, look, I agree with that, discussing the work of Goran Đorđević, and for me also art and language, is very interesting, because there were, I don't agree with you, there were other artists in Yugoslavia who were also criticizing the art institutions and other artists.
They were.
Goran Popović was doing. Then because look, if you look at in Yugoslavia, for example, one particular newspaper or weekly, which was published in Zagreb, called Oko, from 73 onwards. And in Oko, it was edited by Goran Babić. And this information is not neutral information. It's like a leftist poet who anti-nationalist, very active in the socialist institutions, and had this very radical position. So when you look at not only Oko, but when you look at any journal, artists are really fighting against each other and saying very strong opinions about existing institutions. I mean, you can see that in many of the journals. Zoran Popović had the work even about that. And
what I'm trying to say is that they're critical of the institutions concrete, but they are not questioning the idea of Western art that is based on this creative individual. That's why I find Đorđević's position interesting, and that's why that Podrum was interesting, because they really brought it down to this labor point of view, which is different. I can criticize a lot of art institutions, but am I critical towards the institution of art as a Western institution, which has all the problems of invisible labor, of imperialism, of sexism, of all this stuff? So the institution needs to be critiqued to the bone. It should be right? That's why I think that he was really radical, because he was saying art is an illusion, and it's an illusion in the same way that religion is, right? And people didn't want to question that. They did not want to question that. They were for different kinds of institutions, but when they would get into the power positions, they would do the same. And we see that all the time. So that's what I mean. I'm not trying to say that they were not critical. Like, really, that is not what I'm trying to say.
No, I agree. My approach is a bit different. It was not only of, look, Goran Đorđević project was to continue the project of Kazimir Maljević, which in fact was that what artists today have to do is only to research of condition of their work. Suprematism is all about like suprematism. All the paintings are stations of some discoveries or some sort of like research propositions. Goran Đorđević is interesting that while he criticized, and he's not only in that either, I can mention one more artist just came to my mind, but Đorđević's work is that when criticizing institutions, he did from the art point of view. Unlike Zoran Popović, who was harsh critic, also Dunja Blažević was, but she was not an artist, curator, let's say, was from the art point of view, in which way artists are conditioned to do a work, in which way artists are responding to what this practice of theirs are making them to learn, what is the like all these questions. So this is it, like what we learn from our practice, and what we learn from our practice and the history of the art is the point where we are talking from. So it is, he never left art. He never approximate art to look something like self-management, which many did. And these are like, you can immediately, on the first statements of their manifestos, you will understand this is like quite, I would not say fake, but very sterile sort of approximation of artistic practice to self-management. He was not doing that. He was looking at the real conditions, concrete conditions of artistic practice and the way how you can abstract. Now, wasn't this the ultimate, let's say, a position of the modern art, which led to avant-garde art? Let's say Edouard Manet. We can go back to Edouard Manet, Cézanne, which is how we can abstract painting through in the conditions when labor is abstracted.
I disagree. I'm sorry.
This conversation is getting into the same logic as this whole project. So I mean, the whole project actually tries to deal with the contemporary issues, and we got stuck with Yugoslavia with all of these issues.
Now we are going to 19th century.
Conversation is in the same logic. I mean, I'm happy to let you continue this discussion if you want.
I was just trying to say that I think that it's I mean, the avant-garde, you're right. I agree and disagree. What I want to say is perhaps that the whole idea of avant-garde was always connected to a socialist project, right? It was the way art becomes a transformative force in society, like going all the way back to the French Revolution. And in what way this becomes then co-opted by the capitalist machine and these institutions that are functioning is really interesting to me as well. I mean, like, right, I agree. I know what you're saying. It's like if you are questioning the medium, you will eventually come somewhere, right? But I also think that it's important to look at the institution, right? So on one hand, yeah, you can talk about it from the artist point of view, but like then you have Adorno and all these guys who completely forget about the reality, who forget about the artist, the actual person. It all becomes an abstraction. And then we are now here writing books in 2020 about unpaid labor and exploitation. And here we are, right?
But let's see, I think we agree on one thing, and that is
many things.
Goran Đorđević is interesting, especially because he very much value the, let's say, inner, formal or more like artistic questions, even when we talk about the politics. This can also have a very reactionary examples, but quite a good art. I can mention Mladen Stilinović. For example, Mladen Stilinović work about self-management that he equates with dissolution of individuality, with a death, and with all the negative attributes, is a political reactionary position. Okay?
Yeah, of course. It is.
Now, what he does from the artistic point of view, let's say, from the way how he constructs the language, how he constructs the references, how he, for example, use an abstraction to impose all the discussions regarding the abstraction, because where is the richness of the avant-garde, let's say like that. And then he looked at the construction of the language, and all these issues can give potentially a platform to a more leftist socialist interpretations as well, which incidentally did. I mean, Dunja Blažević interpreted his work as in that direction. And what is even more important, VHV interpret like that. It has interpreted Mladen Stilinović work as a quite emancipatory, let's say, political work, which in fact, when you, let's say, look from his artistic production and the way how he sort of saw his practice as this production, as continuous practice, as a learning process, all these things, there are that potential, but it is a potential which you have yourself to work on it, you know? Yeah. I would say that, but even also in Goran Đorđević, there is not an explicit political reference to self-management.
I am not to self-management, but
yeah.
very concrete references to historical materialism and Marx and critique of ideology. So he knew his critical, but
yeah,
he had
that's true.
And
there is a lot of comments and questions from the audience. I think the heated discussion that was happening here provoked also a lot of people. So I will invite Darija to kind of like summarize what was going on in the chat and you know, bring in the conversation the questions from the audience.
Well, first, I'd like to thank you for the super interesting discussion. I think everyone is overwhelmed by the amount of references in general, because we just started popping up like all these links and links to archives. And what I wanted to mention is that we will, together with the recording, there will be a list of all the resources that people link to. So for everyone to research more, because it's kind of, we just started digging into this whole conversation of like really, really interesting archival material and kind of getting living archives, going like super way back and like going into direct discussions between people. So this is like super interesting. From the discussion in the chat, we had a question from Milica Pekic, which was more about the relation between art and language, and what was the result of these conversations, like the conclusion of these conversations between art and language and the artists they talked to in Yugoslavia. And for Katja, it was about whether there is a relation between your current research and your previous practice in the association in Slovenia. And I would personally like to thank you both for creating this really interesting genealogy from the avant-gardes and looking into this like distinction. I think everyone would be interested to hear more about this shift from one type of collectives to the other, and how these processes, how this difference actually emerged, that now we live in a very, very completely different scenario.
Well, actually, in this discussion, I consciously did not want so much to talk about second collectives, because I have written and published, and these things are online to be found or found in the books, quite a nasty things, including about some of my friends, because I was taken very up to the let's say word, the practice of the avant-garde practice and the conceptual art position, which like you really have to generate separations, divisions. And yeah, I mean, look, this was like, this was meant to be done. This was really, I had to do this because not only, as I said in the beginning, that kind of writings were not just like one of academic texts. I mean, it appeared in the academic book because of my friend was editing, and he thought that I can develop it to an academic article, but that was not my idea. My idea was to intervene into existing structures, which I found quite problematic at that time. And so I think denunciation and all these like things, I have done a lot. I took my share in that, and I would do it more, but now I am doing here where I am more active, let's say in Finland.
I also would like to say, no, Sezgin, the other thing that I see is a problem is that we tend to generalize. And I think it is way more interesting to talk about these issues when we don't look at everyone who's a conceptual artist as they're all progressive. They were not. I mean that like all independent art is progressive, forget it. It's not just that the mainstream is conservative. Like there's many shades of gray. And I think that it's interesting to then single out individuals who have really radical, interesting perspectives and to separate these things, right? I think that that's kind of also the role of somebody who can observe and analyze and has the, like I do, the luxury of sitting here and reading all these books, is to distinguish these things, not to just generalize them, right? Because I grew up thinking that art is progressive, but that little did I know how unprogressive it is. And so I think that, for instance, partly why I'm researching these topics comes from the same impetus as yours, I would say, not to develop a theory, but it come from very concrete struggles and that's, I would want to answer that question from Milica. In Slovenia, where I was working in this association of independent cultural organizations and independent artists, where you saw the same kind of distinctions and the same kind of issues where artists didn't want to deal with the fact that they're workers. I said, like, guys, this is our advocacy. This should be this is how we're going to accomplish anything with the Ministry of Culture. We need to package this in the right way. And it was a struggle. Oh, you're not art, we are not workers. I was like, what? I mean, so, you know, like it's, and so partly my whole, you know, the reason why I end up also then researching Yugoslavia and all this was because I was interested, like, why is it such a big problem? And what happens with these things? So I think that that's, yeah, and also these second and first collectives, you know, I think it's an interesting, interesting, and you need to do it. But of course, when you're critical towards people, it's always like that. You know, like
because look, if you address with that apparatus that we have, like let's say critical apparatus, and you address the contemporary production, contemporary situation, of course, you will be critical. There is no escape from that. I mean, lately, to tell a little bit what I am now involved in, is I look at different moments of exit from the existing narratives regarding the political art. I start publishing project. And a big project that we did was to translate for the first time into English language Russian futurists and Russian formalists' writings about Lenin's language. And when you look at that particular little moment which happened in 1924, you see something really amazing. Like these artists and these avant-garde theoreticians, when they studied the language of Lenin, they didn't study the canonical language of Lenin. None of these texts written in 1924 are referring to Lenin's text, such as canonical texts like, let's say, What is to be done, or all these things that are published from beginning of 20th century until First World War. They refer mostly to the last, let's say, 1921 to 1924, 1923 actually, after Lenin couldn't write, the actual articles, theses, declarations, speeches of Lenin, which means they were referring to a living contradiction of Lenin's language. So that was the number one thing, and that we always forget. The avant-garde artists were involved in a very actual situation, and that already that thing, that is contemporaneity, which they thought that their critical apparatus learned from the avant-garde poetry, that is Zaun poetry, will enable them to really understand some things that others missed in the singularity of Lenin's language. This is others, also Western theoreticians wrote like that, particularly George Lukács, who has dedicated a philosophy to a study of actuality, contemporaneity. History and class consciousness is nothing else but to bring the all historical, let's say the tradition of thinking, tradition of whatever transformations have happened and we know about, to today, to class consciousness is today. So main focus was the present, today. All Dadaist project is about annihilation of past and not to have some sort of mysterious futurity, but today. That issue of present and actuality, I think it is a driving force of the avant-garde. And this is where, in fact, all the contradictions in that production can be today actualized because of that. Otherwise, because it was not canonical when it was produced, and it is not canonical also today.
Oh, so that problem. But that what does canon obscures the questions? That's my problem with how avant-garde is canonized in the West.
Yeah, avant-garde is canonized everywhere, unfortunately, but the ideas, which is here writings, I'm not talking about paintings. Like, for example, if you visit in Thessaloniki, which is very near to us, one of the best Russian avant-garde collection in Kostakis collection, you can see immediately what you will see there when you go to 3 floors, the amount of that paintings, drawings, designs, and objects. And this is, we are talking about 10 years. But of course, 1, 2, 3, Lyuba Popova, Malevich, Rodchenko is exempted from that. And this is how history is written, but it's not. There have been hundreds. So it was not a one artwork. It was a general culture, an idea, a worldview. It was a movement. And when you go to the cellar, podrum of Kostakis collection, you see 5 times more works. It's like, and you see like, on what was the driving force which produced this? It is not individual genuine creativity, of course. It is something else. It is the platform. It is, and so when you see the sheer scale of that avant-garde production, of that whatever it is that this works, it makes you to understand this is more than the autonomy of art. This is more than one of 2 pieces. This is like constant confrontation of different proposals, how to see the world, how to sketch the new society, and all these things. It's like
an interesting book also by Christina Kjaer on the
Christina Kjaer, yes.
Imagine No Possessions, right? Where they wanted to redefine the commodity as a camaraderie object and so on. So I totally agree. My biggest issue is perhaps that's because I'm burdened being here in US and meeting people and constantly having some kind of questions about why and so on, is that the way the students in art schools and in general are being taught about these things. That's the problem. I think that's why it's so important what you're doing, publishing these texts and having these kinds of conversations.
Can I add something? Yeah. Christina Kjaer is actually one person that I criticized in my introduction. I wrote quite extensive, but the reason I tell you, because she is introducing what she called intermediary concept called socialist objects.
Yeah, camaraderie objects. Camaraderie
also socialist objects. Yeah. But this is exactly what this avant-garde art, like productivism, like in Boris Arvatov or in Tarabukin or in others constructivist positions, what really meant was not an object, installations, and they had a name for that called ustanovka. And these installations has been analyzed. This is actually my favorite book ever, called by Maria, I don't know how you read her surname, Goof. Maria Goof. This is about art and productivism. What she did, she analyzed the Russian constructivist works, which were like done in the two levels, one as a constructivist and one as a compositions. So it was not any aimed at an object. It was aimed at a solution, at a different way of how you can present things.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm trying to. Oh, you are muted.
I'm sorry. I'm just saying that there has to be a space for Katja to say what she thinks as well, because I think that that's thinking a little bit more. I mean, people from the chat were also complaining.
No, it's fine. No. I was just trying to say that I think that avant-garde is. I'm very looking forward to read your critique, because there's many ways, but like I think that it's really the imperial logic of English discourse, of English or American institutions that we have to confront is a real issue, because the way they talk about the avant-garde, the way they talk about Malevich as the founder of abstraction and it's like, I mean, the guy had a whole philosophy of how to live your life, which is something that the students are not being taught. For instance, I was shocked when I was talking to my colleagues here, for instance, even about the avant-garde, Peter Burger, the German theory of avant-garde. That guy, they criticized the hell out of him because he told them that they have never surpassed the institution of art, that the institution of art after the avant-garde attack of the early 20th century is still here. We still have the art objects. We still have the exceptional artists. The prices on the market are based on the name and the prestige. So like, and so on. So I think that if we really want to be radical, we need to talk about the Western institution of art. We need to talk about, for instance, this is something that I kind of work more in my book, is also about the bourgeois ideology behind it. And the way we talk about these things is, I think, really important to kind of break it down a little bit so that we know what we talk, because art is not this realm of creativity and radicality. It has its history, very concrete history. Western art does. And there are always rebellions, the ones that Sezgin is talking about, or like, you know, like Georgievich and some of the other people that we've mentioned. But the institution has a very concrete and very problematic history that I think when students go to art schools are very often not confronted with these questions. And I think it's something that would, I think, propel more critique, and for them being more critical and more having more ideas about how to transform these kinds of relations and conditions. So yeah.
Okay, thank you both. I will give you, I mean, I'm sorry because I completely disappeared as a moderator. I also got fascinated with your conversation.
It's fine. You know what?
I want to have a separate chat.
Yeah.
Avant-garde. We need to write a book on that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, maybe in the last 5 minutes, I would like to ask you to reflect a little bit more about the contemporary situation and how you see the role of art collectives today. If you can say something, just open this for like a future reflection, I would be very grateful. And we will have to end with this because it's now more than 2 hours that we are talking.
I want to tag along. I just saw somebody said, right, the Enlightenment origins of art institutions are ripe for decolonization. I think that any radical project today, it's sitting here in the middle of US and all the social uprising going on, is precisely that. Let's please analyze the Western institution of art in all its dimensions. I'm working on labor. Sezgin is working on collectives and avant-garde and stuff. There's so much that has to be criticized about the institution of art. And there's also so much, I think, in terms of really interesting examples historically that exist. And I think it is our task as theorists or as writers to make them visible, to promote them, and to fight for their importance and their relevance. So I think that as an art collective, it's really important to have these discussions, but I also agree that the other thing that I always promote is that please, let's talk about art as labor, because until we live in capitalism, until we all need to work to live, we need to like not forget that, because otherwise, I don't know how we will survive and maintain doing any kind of critique if we are perpetuating the illusions about art. It doesn't mean that art is not important. I always have to say this because people are like, oh, you don't like art, you are a frustrated artist. I never wanted to be an artist. I'm not a frustrated artist. I just think that exploitation is unacceptable. That's my problem. I love art. I think it's important. I think like the things that Sezgin mentioned about the research aspects of art and art being less burdened with certain norms, it's extremely important. But at the same time, we need to not forget the class provenance of art, the European white provenance, bourgeois provenance of art, and what that brings along when we talk about art. So that would be my 5 cents.
Thank you.
Well, one thing about actuality, because that's for me a very important question about today's contemporaneous situation and all. If we start this, what you mentioned and somebody wrote there about decolonization of art institutions. What actually this claim implies? This claim implies that art institutions are as the colonial institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I will disagree with this. Why? Because colonial institutions, you know why? Because if we claim that, if this is what that argument implies, then the further on we have to accept that colonialism was as nice as today in art institutions are, where colonialism was not, was a system responsible of millions of deaths, of slavery, of a very brutal exploitation. First of all, slavery. So I would be rather a bit careful about this kind of comparisons. Today, especially, I try to find a way to oppose this equation of what we are in now with the 20s and with the between two world war situation, which is the general fascist situation, like in Trump, like many American artists, also in Europe, let's say people are doing, we are living in a situation like in the 30s, today's our current situation. Well, I don't think so either, because today there is not so much colonial states. There is no colonial states where more than half of there is neo-colonial, but the colonial states in 30s were half of the world. So what I want to say about this, like for the comparison with the past and to find what is the specificity of today, I would rather take steps which are a bit more careful, like especially about decolonization. Decolonize universities. Well, are universities like a colonial system? Is it slavery there?
Of course they are. What are you talking about?
Because this is minimizing the colonial system.
It's not.
The colonial system was not as nice as today.
Oh, no. I mean, I think that's problematic. And like, if you say that art is a colonial institution, or art institutions such as museums are colonial institutions, you're not saying that they are nice. You're actually saying that in addition to killing all those people, to enslaving them and all that, they also have established, right, the soft power, which is the museums, which practice the same horrible things that they have done otherwise, but they are now packaged and presented as beautiful objects of the savages in a museum. I mean, please, it doesn't mean that they are nice. It's just that there's one aspect.
Yes, of course, sure. There is like a colonization at many different segments. But the main thing, the driving thing was slavery.
Of course it was, but I mean, that's why they have the objects in the museum. It's like a derivation of what they did. I'm not saying that there was no slaves. If I say that an art institution, that Western art institutions are a product of, in US, definitely a product of colonial politics, and many other places. I mean, it is a colonial project. It's the question of why we have, even in the outskirts of Europe, in the Balkans, we were colonized at one point.
Yes.
I mean, also, I mean, I would add to this because we were also thinking, like the editorial collective of this project about self-colonization, colonization in regards to art collectives in Yugoslavia. And there was a lot of like fabrication that was happening due to the art politics in the West that was kind of, you know, like focusing on the collective and romanticizing these kind of practices like from 60s on, and how I mean what were actually the implications in the local context, and how local producers and of secondary discourse in the local context actually fabricated some art collectives in the local context just to have, you know, like something to show to the Western art production. So I actually think this is very relevant for understanding the art in Yugoslavia. And I don't think, yeah.
Because I think I think I know what you're saying, Sezgin, or I hope maybe I misunderstand you, but I feel that what you're trying to say is that a lot of these discourses are becoming then an excuse for certain people to keep doing what they're doing, right? And that is something that I you know, like that is definitely, I'm not trying to, I don't think that this is just language. The critique, the language of critique is not just the language, that it can shape certain practices by us discussing this aspect. So it doesn't mean that if I say that the institution of art is a colonial institution, that I'm making colonialism look better. That is absolutely not where I'm coming from, and why would I? And that's why why I would suggest doing something like that. Quite the contrary, I would like this to become an acknowledged fact and let's be wary about that. Let's see to what extent, because it is a colonial institution, has it also affected what we are doing. But it doesn't mean that everything is now problematic because of that. I mean, like I said earlier, I think that it is important for us to make distinctions and to clarify certain things, because we can't just put blanket things on it. So in that sense, I, you know, also want to say that about my like decolonize. It's not all about
that. If there is something I try to say and I didn't say, I can say, but what I wanted to say, I think I was already very clear, which you got like a thesis, is that by emphasizing like or arguing for decolonizing of the institutions is actually minimizing the colonization, which was based on primitive accumulation that we don't have today. Okay, so there is a radical difference in the economy politics. But what I didn't say, there is things that I didn't say, you wanted to read under the line, was not that, but was this. There is a certain decolonial theory which I assume a lot of like academics and curators are using. The colonial theory very much based on this kind of affective understanding of the social movements, which I am absolutely against.
Me too. Me too. Totally.
Okay. So this is the thing, and this for the decolonization, because decolonization movement is a singular movement. It was the people's movement. It transformed 20th century. Decolonization movement is also October Revolution.
Yeah.
All the nations awakening, all the independence, Yugoslavia is also decolonization in the way we understand as a people's movement, which completely destroys not only the social ground of the colonization, but also the economical and the political objectives of the colonization, that is capitalism. You see? No, it's implicitly so when I hear this, even my mouth is not turning to say decolonial theory, you know, as if a decoloniality was some adjective of some like academical. No, but listen, this is like most of the articles that I am reading of the decoloniality in the artistic curatorial discourse, unfortunately, is that.
You're right. I totally agree with that.
Katja, this is what I am sort of all the time trying to make it a bit more weightier. Let's see a bit more what actually is then. Then in the end, if we agree that the colonial theory induced from, let's say, Homi Baba to all these Spivak's theories and all these affectual things. I mean, I'm sorry, but this is of no help for our.
No, but that's not what I'm talking about. When I talk about.
I know, but I just wanted to make this thing clear. So you to say. Yes.
Yeah. No, but I'm not talking about this. That's not what I was referring to, because there's a really interesting text that was written precisely about that subject, that decolonization is not a metaphor. Right? Decolonization is an actual practice, which means dismantling certain types of institutions, like you say, implementing new models. So I totally agree with you that those theories are, for me, as useless as they are to you. But I'm sorry, but it's great. It's great. No, it's great. I love talking, and I love.
Yeah, sure, of course.
I would really like to continue this discussion, but I think that we are now talking for more than like 2 hours and a half, and I think we really need to somehow bring this.
Yeah. Here is like 10:30. So thank you so much. Then.
Yes, I apologize again that I kind of like disappeared as a moderator, but I think that also our audience could gain something from like this direct conversation that was developing between two of you. And thank you so much for bringing so many important points, examples, references that we will really need to work hard to understand, put them in relations, and this is something to research more and further. So thank you so much for this important and passionate conversation. And thank you also to our audience and for their questions and comments, and special thanks to Darija for doing the technical support and moderating the chat, and kuda.org for making this happen. So thank you all once more for this amazing session. This project, this series of public talks is actually coming to the end with this conversation. And if you want to stay informed about the project, please subscribe to kuda.org mailing list, because I think this is the only way that you will be able to be informed about other activities of the project. And for the end, I made this kind of like wish for all of us. So I wish us a chance to create a better society in which, besides no one will be hungry, without home, and right to health care, we will not, our labor will not be on sale. No. So this is the addition from this conversation. Thanks. And thanks very much for opening all of this important stuff related to colonialism, decoloniality. If we had more time, I would expand this in trying to understand, could this logic work in the relationship between the center and the periphery, and all of this like system theory and so on. But let's leave it for another conversation. So thank you.
I wanted to add this, that Bojana Videkanic writes about Yugoslavia from this post-colonial perspective. So she talks but history of Yugoslavia, not contemporary context. So
we are adding this reference to the reference list that will be available together with this talk. So I wish you all a pleasant evening, and I hope you enjoyed this session. And take care, and goodbye. For those who want to stay and chat a little bit more, we will stay here for like a couple more minutes. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you. Ciao. Bye.
For those who want to leave. Are you okay, guys?
Do you have to leave, Sezgin, or not? But seriously.
No, hey, znaš što, ovo možemo da nastavimo, znaš koliko? Do jutra.
htjela